Good morning, everyone. This is Pat McParlin from Opus, and we're thrilled to welcome you to our webinar this morning, the RiskRecon Third-Party Security Risk Management Playbook. So if we go to the next slide, our goal today is to share the results of RiskRecon's Third-Party Security Risk Management Playbook. And our speaker, Kelly White, and I'll tell you about him in just a second, is going to talk a little bit more about the playbook. The playbook is really the results of a survey that RiskRecon did with a number of enterprises. So it's going to give you a first-hand look into some practical solutions around third-party risk management and security employed by these enterprises. I think you'll find it really interesting. I've had a chance to see the results of the survey and frankly found it fascinating. So I think this is really a great session and really looking forward to it. Also give you a chance to compare your own program with the data. We will give you the opportunity to get the results of the full playbook at the end of the session. So I'll give you the link so you can download the full survey results also, so you can take a look at that. And then think about your own goals and objectives and see which of these capabilities and practices that Kelly discusses make sense for you in the context of your own objectives. So if we take a look at the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about Kelly, our speaker. So we are really honored to have you on the phone today, Kelly. Kelly is the founder of RiskRecon, one of the leading security and security ratings companies. So he has nearly 20 years of experience in assessing and defending complex enterprises, which we all know is a super hot topic today. And before dedicating his full attention to RiskRecon in 2015, he's held a number of enterprise security roles. He was the CISO and Director of Information Security for a number of financial services companies, so has been on the ground here. He was also the practice manager and senior security consultant for Cyber Trust and Ernst & Young. He's an active supporter of the security community. He's a frequent speaker at industry conferences such as the Cybercrime Prevention Summit, the United Security Conference, the RSA Conference, the eFraud Global Forum. He's a member of the eFraud Global Conference Board. And as I said, we're really honored and privileged to have you speak today, Kelly. So I'm not going to take up any more of your airtime. I want to give it to you so you can talk about the playbook. So over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for that kind introduction. As was mentioned in this introduction, this presentation is the result of a study that we did of the capabilities and practices that 30 companies have implemented to understand and manage their third-party cybersecurity risk. None of this is about product. It's about capability that we observed in these enterprises. Across these 30 that we did deep studies with, engaging the executives responsible for third-party risk. This presentation is really a subset or summary of the study, and we'll highlight the really interesting areas. There's a lot more data that's useful and really informative for programs. You can get a copy of the playbook or explore it online at www.thirdpartyplaybook.com, where you can get the full details and associated metrics that you can use for benchmarking your own program. So let's go ahead and get into it. As was mentioned, this is an aggregation of real-world capabilities and practices enterprises employ to manage third-party risk through direct interview and on-site studies of 30 organizations. And please keep in mind that these companies in large part were not our customers, so we tried to stay biased and really just get to an understanding of how companies are managing third-party risk. In understanding how companies manage third-party risk, we gathered some demographic information. We'll share a few of those interesting tidbits here. First of all, we asked the question, why manage third-party risk at all? Responses were divided really across three categories. 50% of organizations said, we're really doing this purely for to manage cyber risk exposure. We recognize that our third parties expose us to operational, regulatory, legal, and reputational risk, and we want to manage that. So 50% of organizations are purely doing it from a risk perspective, no compliance motive. 20% of companies, though, readily admit that they are only doing third-party risk management to comply with regulations or with customer requirements. And another 30% have a combination of the two. They can't separate the motive between risk and compliance. One regional healthcare provider, CISO, said it this way: we spun up our third-party security risk program shortly after the FBI informed us that our data was for sale on the dark web. We traced the breach back to one of our vendors. And that's actually a common theme. More and more companies are tracing breaches back to their vendors. Another question. Across the companies that we surveyed, who has the most experience in managing third-party cybersecurity risk? At the time of the study, which was at the beginning of this year, 2018, finance and insurance, on average, had their third-party cyber risk program operating for 6.5 years. So by far and away, if you're looking for companies who have been at it for a long time in managing third-party cyber risk, look to finance and insurance. Healthcare and technology companies came in at about 3 years on average, and manufacturing 2.5 years. There is I think, a strong correlation here between the regulatory drivers behind the industry and the length of times that organizations have had their third-party risk management program in place. I was CISO for a large financial services institution, and remember back in early as 2005, 2006, the regulators were really starting to put focus on third-party security risk management. And I think the healthcare components came on later than that. This next question is, I found to be quite interesting. What % of vendors require cyber risk management? So the math behind this calculation is, if you took an extract of all of the vendors that you have an ongoing relationship with from your accounts payable database, for example, what % of those require ongoing cyber risk management, meaning that you're doing a periodic review of their security program annually or every 2 or 3 years? The overall average was 11.7%. Finance and insurance, 13% of the vendors to the banking and insurance industries have or require third-party security risk management. Healthcare is higher at 19%. Now, the dynamics of the healthcare sector is interesting because there's a very heavy reliance on providers and so on, where you're transiting sensitive healthcare information and so forth. So that was really a common theme. And when you looked at within a given industry, the distribution, what was the variance of the number of, or the % of companies that required cyber risk management, it was actually a very tight band. You could almost predict the finance and insurance was going to say, well, it's between, they'd be between 10 and 15%. And healthcare was really, between 17 and 22%. So very, very tight bands. Manufacturing, we found, number one, the manufacturing companies that we engaged were giant organizations with huge numbers of suppliers, but a very low number of those actually exposed them to third-party cyber risk. So, you know, when you're thinking about your population of vendors that you are actively managing the cyber risk for, it might be useful to take a look at, well, what's that percentage as a total of my vendor population? If you're in finance and insurance and you do that math and find that your number is actually, you know, maybe 5%, you might want to go back to the books and dig into those vendors. If you're in healthcare as well, if you're out of band, then that might be an indicator for you as well to look back at your vendor relationships and make sure that you've properly categorized your risk exposure. The next question we asked, how many security risk analysts does it take to manage a vendor? So explaining the math on this again, if you have 100 vendors under periodic cyber risk management, 100 vendors, and you have 3 analysts, then your calculation would be 1 analyst to every 33 vendors. So when we did that by industry, we found that in finance and insurance, on average, 1 analyst is managing the risk relationship for 73 companies. Healthcare is at 93, manufacturing 102, and technology at 133. We'll be updating this study again, and I'm really keen and interested on tracking this metric because it really goes to the heart, I think, of the efficiency of a program. How many companies can an analyst manage the relationship of? I hope and I expect that we'll see this go up over time as people modernize their processes and so forth. This next slide ties into this, and I think there's a correlation. How many questions do you ask on average when you're doing a survey of your vendors' cybersecurity? How many questions are in that assessment? Look at the large number that we have for finance and insurance. On average, finance and insurance is asking 283 questions. It's a huge amount. Healthcare, smaller but still quite large, 186 questions on average. Manufacturing's the leanest, 69. On average, they're asking 69 questions, and then technology at 87. Now, the correlation here that I think is interesting is that, remember, finance and insurance, on average, 1 analyst can cover 73 companies. Healthcare can cover 93. Look at the number of questions they're asking as part of their study. Finance and insurance has got the highest number of questions, the lowest efficiency ratio. The second one, healthcare, second highest analyst productivity or efficiency ratio, second highest number of questions. So the point being here, and we've actually we did some rough math on this in a blog post to calculate, you know, what's the incremental cost of a question. So think about, though, that as an interesting point in your program, you know, what is the cost of adding another question to your survey? And make sure the risk value that you're getting out of that question is worth the cost. It's not tremendously high, but there is a correlation there.
Hi, Kelly. We have a question from the audience for you, if you'd like to take a question at this point.
Yeah.
When you're talking about the percentage of vendors who are managed by the the third-party risk program, were the figures self-determined or were they mandated by regulation?
That was a calculation that they did just by themselves. So they really just took, okay, well, we've got, you know, 1,000 vendors and we've got 100 under cyber risk management.
I just want you to know your audio is breaking up a little bit too. I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you here in New York. I don't know if other people are having trouble hearing you. So maybe you could repeat that answer.
Okay, is this better?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so the calculation of the percentage of vendors that are under continuous or that are under third-party cyber risk management was just a calculation that companies did on their own. So they said, well, we have a total, for example, of 1,000 vendors, and in our accounts payable database, for example, and we have 100 of those in under third-party risk management. So it wasn't regulatory driven.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay.
So we'll take more questions, and we heard from other people in the audience and not hearing any audio, so maybe on our end as well. So let's keep going.
Okay.
Great, thanks.
Next question here, and this is, people keep on saying, well, and particularly vendors, hey, why can't we just use a standardized questionnaire? We're familiar with some vendors who are, being assessed by 5,000 customers a year, and they're just getting loads of questionnaires of different shapes and sizes from different customers. And the question out there is, can't we all just use a single standardized questionnaire? Well, of the companies in the study, only 29% of companies were using a straight industry standard questionnaire. It might be CyberFit or Cloud Security Alliance or ISO 27001, but it was just 29%. 71% were using a custom questionnaire. Now, when I say custom, it could range from a questionnaire that was completely custom to them. They manufactured their own questions entirely. Or it ranges to, well, we've based our questionnaire on the NIST cybersecurity framework, but we've tweaked it to our own purposes. Added some of our own questions, removed some of the standard questions. Now, the reason that companies stated that they're using a custom questionnaire, well, it's because they have their own risk. They have their own security policy for their organization. Associated with that is their own security standards that are unique to them. And their assessments or their questionnaires are mapped to understanding their compliance with their standard. Any questions at this point before we get into the playbook? That's some of the interesting demographic information that we got out of the study.
Yes, we do have another question, Kelly. So when you talked about the assessor workload stats, does it differentiate between on-site assessments and virtual assessments? Does it differentiate between assessors who are only responsible for risk identification and those who are also responsible for risk remediation and therefore involved in the end-to-end process? So I know that was a long question. If you need me to repeat that, let me know.
Yeah, no, I get the question, and it's a great one. It doesn't differentiate between on-site and virtual assessments, and the estimates that folks gave did include everyone in the full-time employee equivalent of everyone involved in that process. So it might even include a portion of the vendor relationship management team that might be involved in communication and so forth, but did not split out on-site versus virtual.
Great, thanks. Excellent. And another question is, can the third-party assessments be used to underwrite cyber insurance?
we didn't get into that part of the study. This is really about enterprises, for example, a financial institution seeking to understand the cyber risk quality and performance of their vendors.
Okay, excellent. So why don't I let you keep going, and then we're going to have time for a Q&A period at the end. So that would be great.
Okay, thank you.
And just so everyone knows, I know we're going to get the question about will the deck be shared, since we always do. And yes, the deck will be shared. And as Kelly mentioned, the full playbook, which includes all the data and the ability to compare yourself to the enterprise's interview, will also be made available. So just letting everyone on the phone know that as well. So please continue. Kelly, finding this very interesting. So thank you.
Okay, great. So one of the questions that we hear as we engage with the industry, with companies who are operating third-party risk management programs, and what was really the driver behind the study is companies are asking, how are other people managing third-party security risk? What are they doing? What's their process? What capabilities have they implemented to manage that third-party security risk? And so one of the primary objectives, and this is where we're getting to the heart of the study, primary objective was really to understand how companies manage third-party cybersecurity risk. And if you took all of the processes, all of the programs of the 30 companies, and blended them into one program, one cohesive program, this represents the capabilities and practices that you'd see, okay? So 3 practice areas: program management, where you've just got the governance in place, policies, standards, people, you've got training, you have legal and procurement involved, you're tracking vendor risk. So that's program management. Risk assessment then feeds off of that. You've got standards and so forth that mandate that third-party risk be managed, and you have questionnaires and so forth that you've structured. Then you go into the risk assessment, where you're actually looking at each vendor and understanding the inherent risk of the vendor. What's my value at risk with each relationship? And then engaging your resources to understand each of your vendors' risk performance, and then coming up with risk treatment plans as needed. The last program area is monitoring and response, where companies are actually doing some kind of real-time monitoring beyond, maybe an annual assessment, where they're gathering information about the exposure that they face related to their vendors on a day-to-day basis. So we'll get into this. Again, the playbook document has this blown out in detail, and under each one of these capabilities like governance, it lists out the practices that have been implemented and the adoption rate of those practices. So we're going now to talk about these, some highlights about the structure of a program. If you look at the entire set of capabilities and process, not everyone's implementing everything, of course. This area that I have highlighted here represents the common practices, meaning that 50% or more of the companies involved in the study were doing these things. So they have the governance in place. They're assessing the inherent risk of their vendors, and then they're doing an assessment and issuing an action plan. So that's common. 50% or more of companies are doing these things. We get into emerging practices, and emerging practices are those where 25 to 50% of the companies have implemented this capability. training and awareness, doing some things to really intelligently manage risk resources, the analysts and how they engage. And then this thing that we'll talk about a bit, which is continuous surface risk assessment, where they're gathering, they're using open source intelligence data and providers to get objective data about the security quality and risk factor performance of the vendors. And this last area, monitoring and response, pioneering. Less than 25% of companies are doing this. So let's talk about each of these program areas and some of the interesting points. As I said in the summary, this is common. I mean, like 95% of companies in the study have good governance in place. They have the policies and standards, procedures for assessing risk and so forth. And they're doing some things to measure and report risk outcomes for their program. Now, I will say there that one of the gaps that we saw is programs are reporting activity, but a lot of programs are struggling to measure the risk benefit. I found that to be interesting. Under the training and awareness area, 67% of companies are doing things to train their internal stakeholders, legal, compliance, procurement, and so forth. What was really interesting is that we saw some pioneering practices here where some companies are actually starting to train their vendors on their expectations as it relates to cybersecurity performance requirements. So for example, let's say that you are going to come out with a new requirement next year that your vendors encrypt certain data types at rest. Rather than just show up with an assessment for the vendors with that new requirement and then fail them instantly, we're seeing some companies actually give 6 months notice or even a year notice to their vendors. They'll conduct a webinar with their vendors. They'll send out communications, hey, we have a new security requirement related to encrypting these data types at rest, so that vendors have time to get in front of that rather than just being failed at the time of an assessment and managing it as an issue. We're also seeing some companies just bring together key vendors in roundtables, maybe for webinars or for even in healthcare. We're seeing companies bring folks together for a day-long security conference where they talk about emerging cyber risk concerns. One of the things that surprised me in this area is related to the third-party risk tracking. That this ties into what Opus provides through their Hyperos product. But believe it or not, 50% of organizations in the study did not have a centralized risk tracking database where they're actually tracking vendor risk and where they could also have a risk registry. 50% of companies don't have a risk registry related to third-party risk, and they don't even have centralized tracking of their vendors. So that again, pretty interesting. Very common for companies to have legal and procurement integration, and get those legal contractual-based requirements, right to audit and so forth into the contracts. Any questions specifically on this section before we move on to the next? Okay, we'll scoot along. This next area then, with that program management in place where you have the governance and you are doing things to identify the risk of your vendors, we move into the risk assessment. And I'm just looking at the study here to highlight some of those areas. So moving left to right, inherent risk assessment. This is about knowing the inherent risks of doing business with each third party, where you seek to understand the assets at risk and potential negative outcomes of a security failure. This is important in managing the risk. You know, if there's a lot at stake, you're going to put more risk resource at it, maybe in terms of breadth and depth of assessment and the requirements and the frequency of assessment. On average, about 80% of companies have a good, well-formed process in place for assessing the inherent risk of their vendors, understanding, you know, what assets do they have and so forth. So very common. Not a whole lot interesting there. Moving on to risk resource management. This is where, how do you decide how to allocate your internal risk analyst resources to which vendors? Now, the most common way for managing risk resources, your analysts who are reviewing the cyber risk performance of your vendors, is to do a very static resource allocation. And it looks like this. In the inherent risk assessment phase, companies are dividing their vendors into inherent risk tiers. You know, these vendors are critical, high, these are medium, and these are low. And to manage risk, the most common method that we saw was that companies have a very set scope and frequency of assessment. My critical vendors are going to get a questionnaire of 250 questions every year. And my medium risk vendors are going to get 100 questions every 2 years, something like that. So it's very fixed, and it repeats itself just like clockwork. Now, what we saw as an emerging or a pioneering practice, particularly in the healthcare industry, is that organizations are starting to be a little bit more sophisticated about how they determine the scope and frequency of an assessment. And the root driver thesis that they're shifting to is not only what is the inherent risk of the vendor, you know, is this a critical vendor that I would normally do a 250 question assessment every year of, but they're also factoring in how well has the vendor performed in past assessments. If, you know, for example, they got 2 or 3 years of the vendor performing well in the assessments, then rather than assessing every year, they're moving to every 2 years. And maybe for a moderate risk vendor where they might assess every 2 years, if they've been performing well on prior assessments, they're assessing every 3 years. So they're using not only the inherent risk of the vendor to understand the scope and frequency of assessment, but also how have they performed historically. And we're seeing this first and foremost in the healthcare sector. But I'll tell you that the banking sector, even the largest institutions, are seeking to move towards this model. And the benefit of this is you can better allocate your risk resources, your analysts, to the vendors that are known performing poorly and back off on those that are performing well. And it serves kind of as a carrot and a stick for the vendors as well. If you go into a vendor and say, hey, if you do well on your assessments, we're going to assess you less frequently. Said in other words, the beatings will continue until behavior improves. But I'd say that under risk assessment, you know, as you look for efficiency and better risk outcomes, companies are doing things to more intelligently allocate risk resources towards those who are performing poorly. So I'm excited to see how this develops over time. A lot of companies in healthcare are doing this, and the banking industry wants to do it. I think that their hands are just a little bit more tied because of the strict regulatory oversight. So they have to move a little bit more judiciously. This next area under risk assessment is what we call continuous surface risk assessment. Now, the traditional approach for managing third-party risk is to use a questionnaire to ask them, hey, do you have a CISO? Do you have a vulnerability management program? What technology do you use to scan for vulnerability? What's your frequency, and so on? They're questions. The questionnaire and the associated evidence that you ask for, the document reviews, the interviews, and so on, are really good for understanding what organizations have invested in to achieve good risk outcomes across people, process, and technology. The continuous surface risk assessment capability, and full disclosure, this is what RiskRecon provides you an understanding of how well the organization implements and operates on those investments. So the questionnaire might tell you, we use Qualys to scan for vulnerabilities. We do that on our internet perimeter every day and internally every 2 weeks, and we do this type of patching cycle. That's great. That looks good. The continuous surface risk assessment is going to tell you objectively, well, what's the rate of unpatched software on their internet-facing systems? And what's the nature of those? So you get some objective data in addition to the qualitative data that's based on the questionnaire. And what we see is organizations combining the two pieces of information, what they get through the attestation-based questionnaire and what they get through the objective data to get a better understanding of their performance. So your best performing vendors, the ones you can have the highest confidence in, are the ones that, yes, they've made the right investments across people, process, and technology to manage cyber risk. And the objective data, when you examine their external systems, yeah, they've got encryption in place where there's sensitive data in transit. They're encrypting email messages using Start TLS. They're patching all of their systems. Boy, they look great. So I look at them. The questionnaire looks good. The objective data looks good. Or on the flip side, the questionnaire might look good, but the objective data says otherwise. So using those two sets of data, we see companies pulling that together as part of their assessment. Now, again, contextualizing this continuous surface risk assessment, less than 23% of companies, well, I should say about 23% of companies in the study are using that capability in their program. This, of course, all comes together in conducting the third-party assessment and where you're sending the questionnaire, conducting interviews, and so forth with the vendor, and then creating an action plan for the vendor to address issues. Let me pause here for a moment to see if there's any questions. Otherwise, we can just continue to, we can wrap it up with the next section and then leave the rest for Q&A. Okay, let's go ahead and keep rolling. This last area of capabilities is monitoring and response. And actually, this is one of the areas that's really exciting to me, and where customers or companies who have implemented this report getting really good benefits at a fairly reasonable cost. I mean, it's not that much. So what does this mean? Using the continuous surface risk assessment data, where you're leveraging capabilities that you've built internally or that you've bought through a provider, you're gaining insight into, what's the IT infrastructure of the company, what software they're running, who are their hosting providers, what's the geolocation of the systems that your vendor operates, and so forth. That continuous surface risk assessment data enables you to implement some interesting practices. So let's talk about this first one in the lower left, critical vulnerability triage. Apache Struts pops up about every 6 months with a new critical vulnerability. But yesterday it was Apache Struts. Tomorrow it could be Lotus Domino. A lot of organizations want to understand how their vendors are, triaging and addressing certain classes of critical vulnerability, such as what we've seen with Apache Struts. So the common approach is to just survey all the vendors, send an email to them, hey, do you operate Apache Struts in your environment? And if so, what are you doing about it to deal with this issue? Well, the continuous surface risk assessment data can be used to inform the company, your organization, of what software your vendors are actually running. And then you can use that to draw a tighter bead on who you should survey. So for example, well, these 10% of my vendors are running Apache Struts software. I'm going to focus my critical vulnerability triage efforts towards them. Moving to the upper left here, dangerous condition hunting. We see companies implementing capabilities, given that they have an understanding of, for example, the software and the versions of software that their vendors are running. They can run reports of, custom making that says, well, for example, show me all of the companies that are running Windows 2000 or Windows 2003 on the internet or WordPress 2.x. The reason they're doing that is to say, that's kind of a leading indicator. If they're running that software that old, that number one, there's imminent exposure to compromise, but two, it's kind of a indicator that the vendor has some significant gaps in software patching. So they're running queries against the data on a regular basis to identify vendors who might have really, dangerous, highly vulnerable software, and then they're tactically reaching out to the vendor to inform them of the issue and ask them to address it. I mentioned in the continuous surface risk assessment category that it gives you an understanding of the hosting providers that a vendor's using, and also the geographic location of where those systems exist. I want to jump down to this geolocation awareness because it's really timely. We've got a hurricane moving in that's moved in to the eastern shoreboard, and what we're seeing is companies that use the continuous surface risk data capability to run queries to say, well, which of my vendors are potentially exposed to this storm, because we see that they're operating their systems in data centers that are in, for example, North Carolina, South Carolina, where the storm is hitting. So they're proactively looking at that data and then partnering with their disaster recovery BCP teams to identify, okay, well, here's the vendors that might be exposed to this issue, and let's go ahead and look at the systems and the business process that might be impacted. So some really interesting use case there. Again, these aren't super common. Less than 25% of companies are doing these, but we see it rising fast because of the value. This last area, fourth party awareness, understanding which vendors are using what hosting providers. Are they using Rackspace, Amazon? Are they using China Telecom? Are they using, the Russian business network? Are they hosting their systems with a provider in a OFAC regulated country like Iran or something like that? So getting understanding of that, not only for regulatory compliance, but also for understanding the implications. Hey, if the Amazon data center in Ireland goes down, which we've seen it happen before, which of my vendors are going to be exposed? Just a little bit more on this fourth party risk. In the banking sector, we're seeing that the regulators are starting to push on this fourth party question fairly heavily. And so it's something that we see a lot of organizations wrestling with. That regulatory push, from my observation, started in the UK and is now really gaining steam in the United States. So that's the playbook structure. Again, the full details here, you can download the summary and the full details from thirdpartyplaybook.com and get some more insight and information on that. So with that, that's kind of a wrap on this, and we'll turn it over to question and answer.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kelly. And just absorbing your comments around fourth party risk, that was really interesting. That's something that I know we get asked about a lot. So great. So we are starting to get some questions. And for folks on the phone, if you want to use the Q&A panel, you can ask questions of Kelly. And we have gotten some already. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the drivers around third-party risk management. So the first question is, what are some of the drivers that are increasing the need for improved third-party risk management? Can you talk a little bit about that? You touched on that in the presentation, but just see if you could talk about that a little bit more. That would be great.
Yep. I'd summarize it this way. Where the industry sits today, and there's been a growing realization of this over time, but broadly where the regulators and the legal landscape sit today, and frankly, organizations themselves sit, is with this. You can outsource your systems and services, but you cannot outsource your risk. And that's really a summary of what the OCC said to the banking industry, back as early as 2008, when I was a CISO of a large financial institution. It is in writing. And shortened, that statement is, you can outsource your systems and services, have at it, but you cannot outsource your risk. And it goes on to say, you have to understand and manage your risk with third parties, as well as if you manage that related process and systems internally. And that's the theme. You look at, OCC 2013, FFIEC directives in 2014, and so on. That is where the industry sits. You can outsource your systems and services, but you can't outsource your risk. So number one, that's driving it. Number two, we've seen a real compression of cyber regulations that mandate third-party risk management. Banking industry's been at it a long time, but you look at NAIC, the National Association of Insurance, 2015, GDPR, 2016, NYDFS, 2017, the SEC cyber regulations in 2018, all mandate third-party cyber risk.
Great, thanks. That's super helpful. So interestingly, we're just talking about fourth-party risk, and we just got a question about that. So with the inevitable growth of an enterprise's third-party portfolio, how much time do we see companies spending on fourth-party due diligence, or are other alternatives being leveraged?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that organizations are struggling with. And I don't think that the method for managing third-party or fourth-party risk has really settled out. However, I've seen some really interesting, some leading organizations out of the UK that are implementing some patterns that I think will gain traction more broadly. So number one, you have to understand who the fourth parties are. One method for doing that is just asking the vendors, but that's generally seen as it quickly gets out of date, so you have to keep on asking, and you're assuming that the vendor actually knows that. So using objective data that gives you insight into the fourth parties, we see as a common theme. Now, as it comes to managing that risk, number one, organizations are saying, okay, across my portfolio, what are the top 10% of providers? And if you look at the data, not surprisingly, you're going to see Amazon, Microsoft, Rackspace, Linode, companies like that in the top 5 spots. But what are they doing? What are they doing? Well, rather than actually, one of the patterns I see is that they're using objective data to look at themes with hosting providers. For example, what's the rate of data breaches that we see out of certain fourth parties providers? What's the regulatory or the security certifications of the fourth parties? What's the rate of malicious software emanating from those fourth parties? So rather than get into very specific questions and sending your fourth party a questionnaire, which is kind of a non-starter, they're using objective data that they gather themselves or through another party to get general themes. And again, all of this is very early, but that pattern of getting general themes, what's their security certifications and so forth in a certain environment. Really, really interesting there. But I think we'll see this develop more. Now, as you look at the data, and I just want to highlight this a bit because there are differences between your fourth parties. When you look at like the Spectre issue where you had the really good hosting providers, well, I shouldn't say good or bad, but you saw some hosting providers proactively communicating to the industry, hey, this is the issue, this is what we're doing about it, this is what you should do. You had fourth parties doing that, like Amazon and Microsoft and so on were doing that very proactively. You saw other fourth parties who were saying nothing. They were saying nothing about the exposure, nothing about the remediation plans. And so that kind of top level information, if you can collect it and observe it, it really provides some insight into, what's the reliability and quality of this provider from a fourth party perspective. So those high level themes, I think, is what we're seeing right now. People pay attention to.
Well, as you say, certainly a developing area, and I know one that we're all going to be watching to see what happens. Is certainly something that we are hearing a lot about as well. So yeah, thanks for the answer. So we have a question about automation. Is it possible to automate the third-party discovery, or does it have to be more manual? So you mentioned all the the number of questions and the number of analysts and things like that. So let me just repeat the question without my commentaries. Is it possible to automate the third-party discovery, or does it have to be more manual, or is the hybrid way better?
So discovering an organization's third parties, the most common practice is to, number one, integrate from a process perspective with procurement. So put in a check gate where in the procurement process, procurement has to answer a short questionnaire. Does the vendor have will the vendor have any of these data types? Will they have remote access to our environment? A couple short questions to embed in the process. That's the first and foremost and most effective. But that's not automated. Another thing that we see organizations do is that they'll run a report against the procurement database every month to say, hey, what are the new vendors that have been added to procurement, and were those reported to us as it relates to, did they get that kind of risk assessment process? So really tying into that procurement is important. Another, in this world, not everything goes through procurement. Somebody could be using the Monday or AHA product management software. So we see the organizations using CASB systems like sky-high networks that are sitting in line in the network to report, hey, there's a lot of user activity going out to Salesforce or AHA or something like that. So that's a way to discover, just based on the network traffic, who are the third parties.
Great. So the question about industries. So you talked about the difference between the industries with the, it's just referenced the number of analysts, number of questions and things like that. Do you see any industries where the standardization is any more or less common?
Yeah, frankly, I'll say that healthcare seems to be getting along better. They've come together. We see more common use of common questionnaires within healthcare. In fact, almost all use of the standardized questionnaires we saw was out of healthcare. And that might be because of the strong association that they've developed through the NHISAC, where they're doing sharing, and they have some working groups for areas like this.
Great. Well, I think the audience will find it interesting to compare their own industries in the full playbook, which is perhaps a good segue to the, if you don't mind moving to the next slide and the final slide, like click to forward. Yeah, perfect, there. So get the full playbook at www.thirdpartyplaybook.com. So that includes the full survey that you walked through today, Kelly, with the ability to compare to the different industries. So you can benchmark your program and look at the different industries. And I want to also reference that this deck will be sent out to everybody. So that was always the most common question that we get, and we got that again today. So thank you, everybody, for showing interest with that question. So I want to thank you, Kelly, for taking the time to walk through this playbook with us today. I certainly learned a lot, and hope folks on the phone did as well. And we will be sending out the materials. And thank you, everybody, for taking the time to spend with us today. And thank you especially, Kelly, for taking the time and sharing your knowledge with us. I certainly found it very insightful, learned a lot, and I hope the audience did as well, and hope everybody has a very great day. So have a great day. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.